My brother took over our father's restaurant and banned my family from even eating there. This is a business now, not a charity, Diego said, blocking the entrance with his arms crossed. You made your choice when you went to art school instead of culinary school. I stood there, holding my 8-year-old son Tommy's hand, watching through the window as my sister Valentina worked the register, my cousins prepped in the kitchen, and even my nephew bussed tables. For 2 years, I'd watched from the laundromat across the plaza where I folded other people's clothes for minimum wage. Every shift, I'd see the lunch rush, smell the familiar spices drifting across the parking lot, and watch my family's restaurant thrive without me. Dad, why can't we eat at Uncle's place? Tommy would ask when we passed it on our walk home. It smells so good. The truth was too ugly to explain to a child. How Diego had convinced our dying father that I wasn't serious about the family legacy. How he'd rewritten the will while I was at Dad's bedside those final weeks. How the restaurant that should have been split between us became his alone. 4 months ago, Tommy and I were at the discount grocery when we bumped into Mr. Nguyen, who used to deliver produce to Dad's restaurant. Your empanadas were always better than your brother's, he said quietly, then glanced around. I retired, but my nephew runs a food truck commissary. An empty spot just opened up if you're interested. I laughed bitterly. With what money? I make $11 an hour. He studied me for a moment. Your father helped me start my business 20 years ago. No money down, just a handshake. I can offer the same terms. Pay me when you can. Tommy tugged my sleeve. Dad, you could make those cheese things Grandpa taught you. That night, I dug out Dad's old recipe notebook from the one box of his things Diego had let me take. His handwriting made my chest ache. But there, between the pages, were all his secrets. The techniques he'd taught me during those quiet morning prep sessions before Diego would arrive. The following week, I signed the commissary lease. It was just a prep kitchen and parking spot. I bought a used food cart for $800 using my tax refund. Tommy helped me paint it bright yellow. Like sunshine, he said. We started small. Just breakfast burritos and coffee, parked at the construction site 3 blocks from Diego's restaurant. The workers remembered me from when I'd worked with Dad. These taste like Roberto's, one said, eyes widening at the first bite. Better, actually. Word traveled fast in our neighborhood. In week 2, the nurses from the medical center began arriving. Week 3, office workers were calling in orders. By month 2, I had to prep at 3 a.m. to keep up with demand. Tommy would do his homework at a corner table in the commissary while I cooked, occasionally running out to hand customers their change. That's when things shifted. Mr. Rodriguez, who owned the auto shop, offered his parking lot for lunch service. Your brother charges $18 for what you're selling for $8, he said, and yours tastes like your father's used to before Diego started cutting corners. The comparison stung and soothed simultaneously. Within weeks, I had regular spots throughout the neighborhood. Morning at the construction site, lunch at the auto shop, afternoons at the community college. My little yellow cart became a familiar sight. The lunch crowd at Diego's started thinning. I could see it from my afternoon spot. Where lines once snaked out the door, now only tourists and newcomers wandered in. The locals had found me. One Thursday, Valentina appeared at my cart during the dinner rush. Diego wants to talk, she said, not meeting my eyes. He says you're being unfair, competing like this. I looked at my line of customers, 20 deep and patient. Mr. Nguyen's nephew was there, 3 teachers from Tommy's school, and the entire staff from the veterinary clinic. They weren't just customers anymore. Tommy handed a regular her usual order. Extra salsa verde, no cilantro, exactly how she liked it. Just like Dad used to remember everyone's preferences. Tell Diego he's welcome to buy dinner, I said, turning back to my grill. I take cash or card. Valentina's face went through several expressions. You can't be serious. After everything, you're really going to act like... Like what? I interrupted, flipping tortillas with practiced ease. Like someone who was banned from her father's restaurant? Like someone who was erased from her own family's legacy? That person? She left without another word. The following Sunday, Diego himself showed up. He stood by his luxury SUV, the one with the restaurant logo wrapped on the sides. The same logo our father had designed. We need to discuss boundaries, he said. You're confusing our customers. I looked at Diego standing there by his expensive SUV with Dad's logo wrapped across the sides, the same design our father had sketched on a napkin 20 years ago. Something inside me just refused to bend anymore. I kept my voice steady and told him the customers weren't confused at all. They knew exactly what they were choosing, and they were choosing food that tasted like Dad's used to taste before Diego started cutting corners to boost his profit margins. Diego's face went red and he moved closer, using his height the way he always did when we were kids, and he wanted to make me feel small. He said I was being disrespectful to Dad's memory by saying his restaurant wasn't good enough. He claimed I was poisoning the whole community against him with lies about recipe changes. I pulled my phone from my apron pocket and turned the screen toward him, showing the line of customers still waiting at my cart. 20 people deep at 7 o'clock on a Sunday evening. I asked him when was the last time his restaurant had a line like that, and I watched his jaw clench tight because we both knew the answer. The silence stretched between us for a few seconds. Then Diego switched his approach completely. He said he wanted to make me an offer, that he'd pay me $2,000 every month to close down the cart and come work in his kitchen as a line cook. The offer was insulting, and we both understood that. I was probably clearing more than $2,000 a month already, but he was desperate enough to try buying me out anyway. I said no immediately. I told him Dad's recipes weren't for sale, especially not to someone who'd been watering down the salsa and using pre-made tortillas to save money. Diego's face went completely white because he hadn't realized I knew about those specific changes. But customers talk and word gets around in a neighborhood like ours. Diego's voice dropped lower, and he said maybe he should have a conversation with the city about my permits and parking arrangements. He mentioned having connections who could make my business very difficult to operate. I kept my voice calm and told him my permits were completely legal and that Rodriguez was happy to have me in his parking lot. But inside, my heart was hammering against my ribs because I knew Diego did have political connections through Jasper Romero, his business partner who'd invested in the restaurant expansion. Diego stared at me for another long moment, then turned and walked back to his SUV. He climbed in and drove away without another word, his tires squealing slightly as he pulled out of the parking lot. I turned back to my cart and started serving the remaining customers, but my hands were shaking just enough that I had to concentrate extra hard on not spilling anything. Tommy came around from behind the cart where he'd been restocking napkins and asked if Uncle Diego was being mean again. I looked down at my son's worried face and had to figure out how to explain adult conflicts to an 8-year-old without making him hate his own uncle. I told him that sometimes grown-ups disagree about business stuff and that Uncle Diego was just upset because he thought I was taking customers away from his restaurant. Tommy thought about that for a minute, then asked if we were taking customers away. I explained that people got to choose where they wanted to eat, and we weren't forcing anyone to come to our cart instead of the restaurant. That seemed to satisfy him, and he went back to helping bag orders. I finished serving the last few customers around 8:30, packed up the cart, and drove it back to the commissary. The whole drive home, I kept thinking about Diego's threat to contact the city. That night, after Tommy fell asleep in his room, I sat down at our small kitchen table with my laptop and a box of file folders. I pulled out every single business record I had. Permits, licenses, health inspection reports, insurance documents, parking agreements with Rodriguez. I went through each page carefully, making sure everything was perfectly documented and up to date. My business license was current until next March. My food handler certification didn't expire for another 14 months. The health department had inspected me 6 weeks ago and given me a perfect score. The parking agreement with Rodriguez was a simple written contract we'd both signed, completely legal. I knew Diego well enough to know he didn't make empty threats. If he said he was going to cause problems, he meant it. I needed to be ready for whatever he tried next. I made copies of everything and put the originals in a fireproof box under my bed. Then I sent scanned copies to my email account as backup. By the time I finished, it was almost 2 a.m. Monday morning came way too early. I was at the construction site by 6, setting up for the breakfast rush. The workers started arriving around 6:30, and by 7 I had a steady line of customers ordering breakfast burritos and coffee. Around 8:15, a woman in a city uniform walked up to my cart carrying a clipboard. She introduced herself as a health inspector and said someone had filed a complaint about my food cart. She was professional and apologetic, explaining that she had to do a full inspection, but I could tell from her expression that she knew this was harassment rather than a real concern. The inspection took over an hour. She checked my food temperatures with a digital thermometer. She examined my hand-washing setup and watched me demonstrate proper procedure. She looked at how I stored raw and cooked ingredients separately. She checked my refrigeration units and made sure everything was properly labeled with dates. She reviewed my food handler certification and business permits. She even tasted some of the salsa to verify it was made fresh that morning. The construction workers waiting in line started getting impatient, but Miguel, the foreman, told everyone to relax because this was obviously someone trying to mess with my business. Finally, the inspector finished writing notes on her clipboard. She told me quietly that she found absolutely nothing wrong. My food handling practices were perfect, my temperature controls were exactly right, and my cleanliness standards were actually higher than required. She said this was clearly a malicious complaint and that I should document everything in case there were more. Then she wished me luck because she'd seen this kind of business rivalry before, and it usually got worse before it got better. After she left, I served the backed-up line of customers, but my mind was racing. Diego had made his first move less than 24 hours after our confrontation. This was just the beginning. I finished serving the lunch crowd and called Mr. Nguyen from the commissary kitchen while cleaning my prep station. He answered on the second ring and listened quietly while I explained the health inspection and Diego's threats about my permits and parking arrangements. There was a long pause before he spoke. Then he told me he knew a small business lawyer who did free first consultations and would send me her contact information right away. But then he added something that made my stomach turn, saying his nephew mentioned Diego had stopped by the commissary last week, asking questions about my rental agreement and whether I was behind on payments. Diego was digging through everything, looking for any crack he could exploit to shut me down. Mr. Nguyen's voice got harder when he said that his nephew told Diego nothing and sent him away, but I should know my brother was actively searching for ways to destroy my business. I thanked him and hung up, staring at my phone while water ran over the cutting board I'd been washing. Diego wasn't just threatening anymore, he was building a case, gathering information, preparing a real attack. That afternoon, I was back at the auto shop for lunch service when Valentina appeared again. This time, she didn't have the angry defensive look from before. Instead, she stood off to the side, looking uncomfortable and conflicted while I served the line of customers. She waited almost 40 minutes until the rush died down, and only a few stragglers remained. Then she walked up to my cart window and asked quietly if we could talk. I wiped my hands on my apron and stepped around to face her directly. She wouldn't meet my eyes at first, staring at the ground while she twisted her employee badge lanyard between her fingers. Finally, she said that Diego was planning to report me to the city for operating without proper commercial insurance, claiming I was putting customers at risk. But then she looked up and added that she knew I had everything I needed because she'd overheard me talking to Mr. Rodriguez about insurance requirements weeks ago. She was warning me about Diego's next move, giving me advance notice so I wouldn't be caught off guard. I studied her face for a moment, seeing the guilt and confusion there, then asked her directly why she was helping me now after defending Diego and telling me I was being unfair to compete with him. Valentina looked away again, her jaw working like she was trying to find the right words. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, saying she'd been watching the restaurant's books as part of her manager duties and seeing things that didn't add up. Diego had been skimming money off the top for months, paying himself huge bonuses while keeping all the family workers at minimum wage and cutting corners on ingredients to inflate the profit margins. She said watching him take more and more while giving less and less was making her question everything she thought she knew about him and about what really happened with Dad's will. Her hands were shaking slightly as she talked, and I could tell this was costing her something to admit out loud. Then Valentina dropped the real bomb, leaning in closer and telling me that Jasper Romero, Diego's business partner who invested serious money into the restaurant, didn't know about any of the cost-cutting or the personal expenses Diego was charging to the business account. She'd seen Diego's personal car payments, his luxury watch purchase, even his vacation expenses all running through the restaurant's books disguised as business costs. Valentina thought if Jasper knew the truth about how Diego was running the business into the ground while getting rich off it, he might force major changes or even buy Diego out completely. She looked scared saying this, like she was betraying family by exposing Diego's fraud, but she also looked determined in a way I hadn't seen from her before. I asked if she was sure about what she was seeing, and she nodded, pulling out her phone to show me photos she'd taken of certain expense reports and invoices that clearly showed the discrepancies. 2 days later, I met with the lawyer Mr. Nguyen recommended at her office downtown. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who reviewed every single document I brought with careful attention, going through my permits, licenses, health inspection reports, insurance policies, and parking agreements line by line. After almost an hour, she looked up and told me bluntly that everything was completely legal and properly documented, better than most food cart operations she'd seen actually. But then she advised me to start keeping a detailed written log of every interaction with Diego, every threat, every attempt at harassment or interference. Because if this situation escalated, I might need to file for a restraining order or even pursue legal action for intentional interference with my business. She made me promise to document everything with dates, times, witnesses, and specific details, then gave me her card and said to call immediately if Diego did anything that felt threatening or dangerous. The consultation was free, but she made it clear she was available if I needed actual legal representation later. The next morning, I arrived at the construction site at my usual time around 6, but Diego's black SUV was already parked directly in my normal spot. He was sitting in the driver's seat with his arms crossed, staring straight ahead like he was on some kind of mission, clearly trying to block me from setting up for the breakfast rush. The construction workers were already arriving for their shifts, standing around in groups looking annoyed and checking their watches because they wanted their breakfast burritos and coffee before starting work. I could feel my anger rising, but I forced myself to stay calm, remembering what the lawyer said about documenting everything and not giving Diego ammunition to use against me. Instead of confronting him or making a scene, I simply drove my cart to an alternate spot about 20 feet away near the site office and started setting up my grill and prep station like nothing was wrong. The workers saw what I was doing and immediately started forming a line at my new location instead of leaving or complaining. Miguel, the foreman I'd gotten to know over the past months, walked over to Diego's SUV and rapped hard on the window with his knuckles. I couldn't hear exactly what he said, but I saw him pointing at Diego's vehicle and then at a marked area behind it, gesturing firmly. Diego's face went red and he started arguing, but Miguel just kept pointing and shaking his head. Finally, Miguel pulled out his phone like he was going to call someone, and Diego started his engine and peeled out of the parking lot with his tires squealing slightly. The workers actually cheered and clapped, and Miguel walked over to my cart grinning, saying Diego had been blocking a vehicle access point, and if he didn't move immediately, Miguel would have had to call a tow truck. The guys in line were laughing and making jokes about Diego's desperate attempt to mess with my business, and the whole incident just made them more loyal to me. While I was serving breakfast, Miguel told me something else that made the situation even clearer. He said Diego had shown up about 20 minutes before I arrived, trying to hand out discount coupons for his restaurant to the workers as they came onto the site. But nobody took them, Miguel said, because the guys all preferred my food and didn't trust Diego after seeing how he'd treated me and tried to block my cart. Miguel's voice got more serious when he added that Diego had looked desperate and angry, almost manic in the way he was pushing the coupons at people and insisting his restaurant was better. That worried me because desperate people do unpredictable things, and I had no idea what Diego might try next if his obvious tactics kept failing. I thanked Miguel for the information and for getting Diego to move, then focused on cooking and serving. But my mind kept spinning through possible scenarios of what my brother might do when he realized intimidation and blocking tactics weren't working. That evening, I picked up Tommy from the school and found him waiting by the front office with his backpack and a plastic container in his hands. He climbed into the car and immediately told me that Aunt Valentina had come by during lunch to drop off food for him, homemade empanadas that she said were made using Grandpa's recipe. Tommy's voice got quieter as he said that Valentina seemed really sad and told him she was sorry for everything, that she wished things were different with the family. My heart broke hearing this because I knew exactly what Valentina was going through, caught between Diego's manipulation and lies and her own conscience telling her that what happened to me wasn't right. Tommy asked if Aunt Valentina was okay and if we were going to be a family again someday. And I had to swallow hard before answering that I hoped so, but it was complicated, and adults sometimes made mistakes that took a long time to fix. That night after Tommy went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone and thinking about what Valentina had told me about Jasper not knowing the truth. I pulled up the restaurant's number and called before I could talk myself out of it, my heart pounding while it rang. A woman answered, her voice professional and warm, and I asked to speak with Jasper Romero about a business matter. She identified herself as Magnolia, Jasper's wife, and explained that Jasper was traveling for work, but she handled all the restaurant's financial oversight and would be happy to meet with me about whatever I needed to discuss. I hesitated for just a second, then told her I had information about the restaurant's operations that she and Jasper needed to know, information about how Diego was really running the business. There was a pause on the line, then Magnolia's voice got very focused and serious, asking if I could meet her tomorrow afternoon at a coffee shop near the restaurant to discuss this privately. The next afternoon, I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early and sat at a corner table with Dad's recipe notebook and a folder of printed comparisons I'd put together the night before. My hands felt shaky as I spread the papers out, checking them for the third time to make sure everything was clear and organized. Magnolia walked in exactly on time, a tall woman in her 40s wearing business clothes and carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive. She spotted me immediately and came over, her handshake firm and professional. I started talking maybe too fast, explaining how Diego had switched from fresh tomatoes to canned for the salsa, how he'd started using pre-shredded cheese instead of buying blocks, and grating it daily like Dad always did, how the tortillas came frozen now instead of being made fresh each morning. I showed her Dad's original recipes written in his careful handwriting next to photos I'd taken of the current menu prices, which had gone up by 30% in 2 years while the portions got smaller and the quality dropped. Magnolia pulled out a notebook and started writing, asking specific questions about suppliers and ingredient costs and preparation times. She wanted to know exactly when each change happened and whether Diego had discussed any of them with the kitchen staff or just implemented them without input. I told her everything I knew from talking to customers and the few family members who still spoke to me quietly, including how Diego had fired 2 longtime cooks who complained about the recipe changes. She stopped writing and looked up at that, her expression getting more serious. Then she told me something that made my stomach flip. The restaurant's revenue had dropped 18% over the past year, despite Diego's reports to Jasper claiming everything was stable and profitable. She'd been reviewing the quarterly statements and something felt wrong about the numbers, but Diego always had explanations ready, and Jasper trusted him because of the family connection. I could see her putting pieces together in her head, realizing that Diego had been lying about more than just recipes. She asked if I'd be willing to provide a written statement about the quality changes and timeline, and I agreed immediately. We talked for almost 2 hours, going through every detail I could remember about how Dad ran the restaurant versus how Diego managed it now. When we finally finished, Magnolia thanked me and said she'd be conducting a thorough review of the restaurant's operations and finances starting immediately. I drove home feeling relieved but also scared about what I'd just set in motion, knowing Diego would figure out eventually that I was the one who talked. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was prepping vegetables at the commissary at 5 in the morning. Valentina's voice came through panicked and talking fast, saying Magnolia had shown up at the restaurant yesterday afternoon, demanding to see all the financial records and supplier invoices going back 3 years. Diego apparently tried to refuse, claiming she didn't have authority to audit without Jasper present, but Magnolia calmly reminded him that she represented the majority investor and had full legal right to review any business records at any time. Valentina said Diego's face went white, and he started making excuses about needing time to organize everything, but Magnolia just sat down at a table and said she'd wait while he gathered the documents. The audit started that same day, and was still going on, with Magnolia bringing in an outside accountant to help review everything. Valentina sounded stressed and worried, asking if I knew anything about why this was happening, and I had to decide in that moment whether to tell her the truth. I admitted that I'd met with Magnolia and told her about the recipe changes and quality problems, and there was silence on the line for several seconds. Then Valentina said quietly that she was glad someone finally did something because she'd been watching Diego destroy what Dad built and feeling powerless to stop it. Over the next 3 days, Valentina sent me text updates that painted a picture of Diego falling apart under pressure. He'd yelled at 2 servers for minor mistakes, something Dad never would have done. He'd messed up multiple orders during lunch rush, forgetting tickets and mixing up modifications. One text said he'd been drinking in the office during work hours, which made my chest hurt because Dad had a strict rule about never having alcohol in the restaurant during business hours. The kitchen staff were walking on eggshells, and several family members working there had started talking quietly about looking for other jobs. Valentina said the whole atmosphere had changed from tense but functional to actively toxic, and she was worried about what would happen when the audit finished. On the 3rd day of the audit, Magnolia called me directly. Her voice was cold and angry in a controlled way that was somehow scarier than yelling. She said the audit revealed that Diego had been systematically overcharging the business for supplies by using a vendor he partially owned through a shell company. Essentially, he was paying himself twice, once as restaurant manager and again through inflated supplier invoices, while simultaneously reducing food quality to maintain profit margins that looked good on paper. The fraud went back almost 2 years and totaled over $40,000 that had been siphoned out of the business. Magnolia said she was appalled and that Jasper was cutting his business trip short to return home and handle this situation personally. She thanked me again for bringing the problems to her attention and said that without my information, Diego might have continued the fraud indefinitely. I sat in my car after that call feeling strange, like I should be happy about Diego getting caught, but instead just feeling sad about how far he'd fallen from the person Dad tried to raise him to be. That weekend, I was running lunch service at my cart when I noticed a man in nice clothes standing at the end of my line, not looking impatient despite the 20-minute wait. When he finally reached the front, I recognized him from old photos at Dad's restaurant. Jasper looked older than in the pictures, but still had the same calm, serious expression. He ordered 3 different items, a breakfast burrito, 2 empanadas, and a tamale, then took them to a nearby bench and sat down to eat. I watched him between customers, seeing how he took his time with each bite, really tasting and thinking about the food instead of just eating quickly. After he finished, he threw away his trash and walked back to my cart, waiting politely for me to finish with my current customer before speaking. Jasper introduced himself and said the food tasted exactly like he remembered from 20 years ago when my father first opened the restaurant. He said he'd invested in Dad's business because the food was exceptional and authentic, and he'd watched with disappointment as quality declined under Diego's management without understanding why, until Magnolia's audit revealed the truth. Then he asked if I'd be interested in discussing a business partnership, because he wanted to restore the restaurant to Dad's original vision, and he needed someone who actually knew how to cook the authentic recipes the right way. I felt stunned standing there with my spatula in hand, customers waiting behind Jasper, trying to process what he was offering. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to reclaim what should have been mine from the beginning, but another part felt protective of what I'd built with my cart. I told him honestly that I needed time to think about it because the cart was mine, something I'd built from nothing with my own hands and my son's help, and I wasn't sure I wanted to give that up even for the restaurant. Jasper nodded like he understood completely and pulled out a business card, saying the offer stood whenever I was ready to discuss it further. Then he added something that made my decision easier. He said that regardless of whether I accepted the partnership, he was removing Diego from the restaurant management immediately because the fraud and mismanagement were completely unacceptable and violated every principle of business integrity that Jasper valued. I took the card and thanked him, then watched him walk back to his car, my mind spinning with possibilities I hadn't let myself imagine before. The next day, Valentina called with news that felt both satisfying and sad at the same time. Diego had been officially removed as manager and banned from making any financial decisions, though he still retained a minority ownership stake that Jasper couldn't legally take away without a lengthy court process. Valentina said Diego had a complete meltdown when Jasper delivered the news, screaming that I had destroyed everything and turned the family against him, refusing to accept any responsibility for his own actions and choices. He'd blamed everyone except himself, claiming I was jealous and Magnolia was biased, and even Jasper was being unfair despite the clear evidence of fraud. Security had to escort him out of the restaurant when he wouldn't leave voluntarily, and Valentina said it was one of the most painful things she'd ever witnessed. Later that same day, Valentina called again to tell me that Jasper had offered her the temporary manager position while they figured out long-term plans for the restaurant. She'd accepted on the condition that all family workers get raises to fair wages, something Diego had refused to do despite the restaurant's profitability. Then her voice got quieter and more personal, saying she wanted to make things right between us and hoped we could rebuild our relationship after everything that had happened. She apologized for not standing up to Diego sooner, for letting fear and family loyalty keep her silent when she knew what he was doing was wrong. I told her I understood how hard it was to go against family, especially someone as manipulative as Diego could be, and that I wanted to rebuild our relationship too. We made plans to meet for coffee the following week, just the two of us without business or Diego or any of the complications, just two siblings trying to find their way back to each other. After we hung up, I stood in my commissary kitchen surrounded by the smell of spices and fresh tortillas, thinking about how much had changed in just a few days and wondering what Dad would think about all of it. The next week passed in a strange blur of routine and uncertainty. I kept running my cart at all the usual spots, flipping tortillas and taking orders and making small talk with regulars, but my mind kept drifting to Jasper's offer. Tommy noticed on Wednesday morning at the construction site when I handed a customer the wrong change and had to apologize and fix it. He pulled my sleeve during a break between orders and asked if something was wrong, his face scrunched up with worry the way it got when he sensed problems. I crouched down to his level and explained in simple terms that Jasper wanted me to help run the restaurant, but I wasn't sure if that meant giving up our cart. Tommy listened carefully while I laid out both options, trying to be fair about the pros and cons of each choice. I asked him what he thought we should do because this decision affected both of us. Tommy surprised me completely with his answer. He said he liked our cart because it was just us and we got to talk to customers and be outside, and he worried that working in a restaurant would mean I'd be inside all day and he wouldn't see me as much. His words hit me hard because I'd been so focused on the money and the prestige of partnering with Jasper that I hadn't thought about what mattered most. Our cart wasn't just a business, it was our time together, our connection to Dad's memory, our independence. That night after Tommy fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and figured out a different approach. I called Jasper the next morning and proposed an arrangement where I'd provide consulting on recipes and techniques to restore the restaurant's quality, but keep running my cart independently. I explained that the restaurant and cart could coexist by serving slightly different menus and price points, appealing to different customer needs instead of competing directly. Jasper got quiet for a moment, and I worried I'd insulted him by rejecting his partnership offer. Then he started talking fast and excited, saying he loved the idea and had been thinking along similar lines himself. He proposed that the restaurant focus on sit-down dinner service with the full traditional menu, while my cart continued serving quick and affordable breakfast and lunch to working people. He offered me a consulting fee that was generous but not so much that it would make me give up my independence or feel obligated beyond the specific training work. We spent an hour on the phone working out the details, and by the end I felt like we'd created something that honored both Dad's legacy and my own path forward. The lawyer reviewed the contract the following week and approved it with a few small changes. The arrangement was simple and clear. I'd spend 2 mornings a week at the restaurant training the kitchen staff on Dad's original recipes and techniques while maintaining my cart operation the rest of the time. I signed the papers in the lawyer's office with Tommy sitting beside me doing his math homework. The first training session at the restaurant was scheduled for the next Tuesday morning. I drove there early with my stomach tight and my hands gripping the steering wheel too hard. Walking through the back door into Dad's kitchen for the first time in over 2 years made my chest hurt in a way I wasn't prepared for. Everything looked the same but different, familiar equipment in familiar places, but rearranged slightly, updated but still recognizable as the space where Dad had taught me everything. Valentina was waiting there, and when she saw me, she started crying before either of us said anything. We hugged for a long time in the middle of the kitchen, both of us shaking a little, and she whispered that she was sorry for not standing up to Diego sooner. I told her I understood, and that we were here now, and that's what mattered. The kitchen staff arrived at 6 and gathered around the prep station, where I'd laid out ingredients for Dad's salsa recipe. They were eager to learn, asking questions before I even started, and several of them admitted they'd been frustrated that Diego forced them to use shortcuts and inferior ingredients. I walked them through Dad's technique for roasting the tomatoes and peppers, explaining how the char added depth that you couldn't get from canned ingredients. When they tasted the difference between Diego's version and Dad's original recipe, their faces changed, eyes widening with the kind of recognition that comes from finally understanding something you'd been missing. One of the cooks, an older guy who'd been there since before Dad died, actually teared up and said it tasted like the old days. We spent 3 hours that morning going through techniques, and I left feeling like maybe this arrangement would work after all. For 2 weeks, everything ran smoothly. I did my training sessions at the restaurant and ran my cart, and Tommy helped out after school, and customers kept coming back. Then Diego showed up drunk at my cart one Thursday evening during the dinner rush. I was serving a line of about 15 people when I heard his voice cutting through the normal noise, loud and slurred and angry. He pushed past customers and started yelling that I'd stolen his restaurant and turned everyone against him, that I was a snake who'd manipulated Jasper and poisoned Valentina's mind. Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward and told Diego to leave, but Diego just got louder, knocking over the condiment station and causing customers to back away nervously. I stayed behind my cart and kept my voice calm, telling Diego he needed to go home and sleep it off. He called me names I won't repeat and lunged toward the cart before Mr. Rodriguez and 2 other customers grabbed his arms. Rodriguez pulled out his phone and called the police while Diego struggled and shouted. The cops arrived within minutes and escorted Diego away, while my remaining customers watched with uncomfortable expressions. I apologized to everyone and offered free meals, but most people just wanted to leave. After I closed up early and drove home, Valentina called with her voice tight and upset. She apologized for Diego's behavior and explained that he'd been spiraling since losing control of the restaurant, drinking heavily, and refusing to accept responsibility for anything. She said the family had arranged for him to enter a treatment program for his drinking, and they were trying to get him help. She wanted me to know in case he tried to harass me again, and she sounded scared in a way that made me realize how bad things had gotten. I thanked her for the warning and sat on my couch after hanging up, thinking about my brother and how far he'd fallen. The next morning, I met with the lawyer and filed for a restraining order, bringing documentation of Diego's harassment, including the parking lot blocking incident and the drunken scene at my cart with statements from Mr. Rodriguez and other witnesses. The lawyer said I had a strong case, and the judge would likely grant at least a temporary order. 3 days later, I stood in a courthouse waiting room holding the paperwork, while a clerk called names from a list. When my turn came, the judge reviewed the evidence and asked a few questions about the incidents and my safety concerns. She granted a temporary restraining order that prohibited Diego from coming within 100 yards of my business locations or contacting me directly. The order would last for 6 months with a hearing scheduled to determine if it should become permanent. I walked out of the courthouse with the signed papers in my hand, feeling both relieved and sad because it had come to this with my own brother. Over the next few weeks, the restaurant went through changes that felt like watching Dad's place come back to life. Jasper brought in the suppliers Dad used to work with, the ones who delivered fresh produce every morning instead of the cheap frozen stuff Diego had switched to. The kitchen got new equipment, proper ventilation that actually worked, and Jasper raised everyone's wages by $3 an hour. I kept doing my training sessions twice a week, showing the cooks how Dad made his mole from scratch, the way it took 2 days of slow cooking and 20 different ingredients. The staff started smiling again, taking pride in what they served instead of just going through the motions. Customers noticed the difference within days. One morning at my cart, a woman named Olivia stopped by during the breakfast rush. She ordered a breakfast burrito and ate it right there, taking careful bites and making notes on her phone. She introduced herself as a food critic for the neighborhood newspaper and mentioned she was Jasper and Magnolia's daughter. She remembered eating at Dad's restaurant as a kid, back when the food was different, better. She asked if she could come back and try more items, and I said sure, anytime. 3 days later, she showed up at the restaurant during my training session. I watched her order Dad's chile rellenos, the ones I'd just taught the kitchen staff to make properly again, and she closed her eyes after the first bite like she was remembering something important. The following week, her review came out in the Wednesday paper. Tommy brought it home from the school because his teacher had seen it and made copies for the class. The article called my cart Honest, affordable food that honors tradition, and praised how I'd kept Dad's recipes alive while serving working people who couldn't afford fancy restaurant prices. Then she wrote about the restaurant, calling it a welcome return to authentic family recipes after years of decline. She didn't name Diego directly, but she mentioned how the previous management had prioritized profits over quality, and how the recent changes brought back the flavors she remembered from childhood. Business picked up immediately for both places. My cart lines got longer and the restaurant started getting reservation calls for dinner service. Jasper called me that Friday sounding excited, saying they'd had their busiest week in 2 years. 2 weeks after the review, Tommy's school principal called and asked if I could do a cooking demonstration for the students as part of their cultural heritage program. They wanted kids to learn about traditional cooking from different backgrounds, and someone had suggested me after reading the newspaper article. I agreed and brought Tommy with me on a Thursday afternoon. We set up in the school cafeteria with portable burners and ingredients for simple cheese quesadillas. 30 kids sat in a circle around our cooking station, watching as I showed them how to heat the tortilla, fold it properly, and get the cheese to melt just right. Tommy helped hand out samples and answered questions about how Grandpa taught me these same techniques when I was their age, in the early mornings before the restaurant opened. The kids loved it, asking questions about spices and cooking times and whether they could make this at home. After we finished and cleaned up, several parents who'd been watching from the back approached me. A mom asked if I'd ever thought about teaching weekend cooking classes for families. Another dad said his kids had been talking about the demonstration all week and wanted to learn more. A third parent mentioned she'd been looking for activities to do with her daughter that didn't involve screens. I realized there might be demand for something like this, a way to teach Dad's recipes beyond just selling food at the cart. It could bring in extra money and spread his cooking legacy to more people. I talked to Mr. Nguyen's nephew about using the commissary kitchen on Sunday afternoons when it was normally empty. He said the space just sat there on weekends anyway, so why not? I started offering monthly cooking classes the following month. Tommy became my official assistant, helping set up ingredients and demonstrating techniques to the other kids who came with their parents. We taught simple traditional dishes, things families could actually make at home without fancy equipment. Empanadas, rice and beans done properly, homemade salsa, basic tamales. I'd tell stories about Dad while we cooked, how he learned from his mother, how he'd wake up at 4 a.m. to prep, how he believed good food brought people together. The classes filled up fast, 12 families each session, and I charged $50 per family, which covered ingredients and gave me decent profit. It became this thing people looked forward to, parents and kids cooking together and learning about tradition and food history. The extra income helped, but more than that, it felt like I was keeping Dad's memory alive in a way that mattered. 3 months after we started the classes, Magnolia showed up at my cart during the lunch rush. She waited until the line died down, then pulled out a folder with financial reports. She showed me numbers that proved the restaurant's revenue had increased 40% since they'd brought back the quality ingredients and proper recipes. The customer count was up, the average ticket price was higher because people were willing to pay for better food, and the online reviews had gone from mostly negative to mostly positive. She credited my consulting work and the recipe training I'd been doing. Then she said Jasper wanted to make the arrangement permanent by offering me a small ownership stake in the business. I met with Jasper and Magnolia at their house the following Sunday, while Tommy played with their dog in the backyard. They proposed giving me 15% ownership in exchange for ongoing recipe consultation and staff training. I'd still run my cart as my main business, but I'd have a stake in the restaurant's success and a voice in major decisions. The lawyer I'd worked with for the restraining order reviewed the contract and confirmed it was fair, protecting my interest while giving me financial security I'd never had before. I signed the papers 2 weeks later. 6 months after that parking lot confrontation with Diego, both businesses were doing better than I'd imagined possible. My cart had expanded to a second cart that Mr. Nguyen's nephew operated using my recipes and techniques. He'd park at the community college while I covered my regular morning and lunch spots, and we'd split the profit 60-40. The restaurant had a waiting list for weekend dinner reservations and had hired 3 new servers to handle the increased business. Valentina and I started meeting for coffee every Wednesday morning at the shop near the commissary. We'd talk about family stuff, business decisions, life in general. She told me about the guy she'd started dating, a teacher from Tommy's school who'd come to one of my cooking classes. She seemed genuinely happy for the first time in years, lighter somehow, like she'd been carrying weight she could finally put down. She'd stopped defending Diego's choices and started making her own decisions about what mattered. We didn't talk about Diego much, but when we did, it was without the anger that used to fill every conversation. Some wounds take time to heal, and some relationships never go back to what they were. But sitting there with my sister drinking coffee and laughing about normal things felt like its own kind of success. 2 months later, a woman called my phone and introduced herself as Diego's therapist from the treatment program. She explained that Diego had completed the program successfully and was asking if I'd be willing to meet with him in a mediation session at her office. My first reaction was to say no and hang up, but she asked me to think about it for a few days before deciding. I called the lawyer that night and explained the situation. She said mediation might actually help by providing closure and setting clear boundaries for how we'd coexist in the same community going forward, especially since the restraining order would eventually expire. The session was scheduled for the following Thursday at 2 p.m., which meant closing my cart early and asking Mr. Nguyen's nephew to cover my afternoon spot. The therapist's office was in a small building near the community college, with plain beige walls and uncomfortable chairs in the waiting room. Diego arrived 5 minutes after me, looking thinner than I remembered and wearing regular clothes instead of his usual expensive shirts. We sat across from each other at a round table while the therapist explained the ground rules about respectful communication and taking turns speaking. Diego went first and his voice shook when he started talking. He said he'd spent the past months in treatment, thinking about why he'd acted the way he did, and his therapist had helped him understand that he'd been threatened by my talent in the kitchen. He admitted that Dad had spent more time teaching me because I was genuinely interested in learning, while Diego had been more focused on the business side and making money. The hardest part was when he said he'd manipulated the will out of fear and feeling like he wasn't good enough, not because he actually believed he deserved the restaurant more than me. He looked directly at me and apologized for banning my family, for trying to sabotage my cart business, and for the drunk scene in the parking lot. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness because he knew he didn't deserve it, but he wanted a chance to eventually earn back some trust over time. I sat there processing his words while the therapist waited patiently for my response. Part of me wanted to stay angry because anger had fueled me through building my business from nothing, but another part recognized that Diego looked genuinely broken and remorseful in a way I'd never seen before. I told him I accepted his apology, but that rebuilding trust would take years, not months, and he needed to understand that. I explained that the restraining order boundaries had to stay in place, and he needed to stay completely away from my cart and my business operations. Diego nodded and said he understood, then asked if he could say something to Tommy. I tensed up immediately because involving my son felt like crossing a line, but Diego quickly clarified he meant just an apology, nothing more. He said he was sorry for confusing Tommy and causing him pain by being so hostile when Tommy had only ever been a kid who wanted to eat at his uncle's restaurant. That apology meant more to me than anything else because it showed Diego understood how his actions had hurt an innocent child. 3 weeks after the mediation, Jasper called me and asked to meet for coffee. He'd been talking with Diego's therapist and reviewing Diego's progress reports from the treatment program, and he wanted to discuss a potential path forward. We met at the same coffee shop where Valentina and I had our Wednesday meetings, and Jasper laid out his proposal. He was willing to offer Diego a limited role back at the restaurant if Diego maintained complete sobriety and completed an additional 6 months of counseling. The role would involve working in the kitchen under the head chef's supervision, with no management authority and no access to financial decisions or supplier relationships. Jasper made it clear that Diego would never have management control again, and the first sign of old behavior patterns would mean permanent removal. Diego had apparently accepted these terms already, which surprised me because the old Diego would have seen it as humiliating to work under someone else in what used to be his restaurant. Jasper said the change in Diego's attitude was dramatic, and while he remained cautiously optimistic, he wanted to give Diego a chance at redemption if he continued proving himself. Tommy's 9th birthday fell on a Saturday, and I decided to throw his party at the commissary with cooking activities for all his friends. 12 kids showed up wearing aprons we'd bought from the restaurant supply store, and I taught them how to make simple quesadillas and decorate cookies with colored icing. Tommy was in his element, showing his friends where we stored ingredients and explaining how the industrial mixer worked. Valentina came and brought a remote control car that Tommy had been wanting for months, and she stayed to help supervise the kids and clean up the inevitable mess. The biggest surprise was a card that arrived in the mail that morning with Diego's handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a birthday card with a heartfelt message about how proud he was of Tommy for being such a good helper in the family business, and he hoped Tommy would have a wonderful birthday celebration. He respected the boundary of not attending in person, which showed he was actually following through on his commitment to change. Tommy read the card twice and then carefully put it in his backpack to save it. The following Monday, Rodriguez showed up at my lunch spot with a proposal that caught me completely off guard. He'd recently bought a second auto shop location across town, about 20 minutes away in a neighborhood I'd never worked before. The area had a lot of office buildings and a hospital, and he thought my cart would do great business there during lunch hours. He offered me the same parking arrangement we had at his current shop, and I realized my little food cart business had grown into something with real expansion potential. I spent that evening running numbers and making lists of what I'd need to make it work, because operating in 2 locations simultaneously would require either a second cart or splitting my time between spots. I hired 2 employees the following week after interviewing about a dozen candidates. Both were young people from the neighborhood who reminded me of myself at their age, working hard and looking for opportunities to learn and build something. Maria was 19 and saving money for community college, while Carlos was 17 and helping support his family after his father got injured at a construction job. I taught them Dad's recipes and techniques, showing them the same morning prep routines that Dad had taught me years ago. They picked things up quickly and took pride in the work, and I felt like I was continuing the legacy of passing down knowledge the way Dad had done with me. Within 2 weeks, Maria was running the new location at Rodriguez's second shop, while I handled the original spots, and Carlos worked both locations depending on where we needed extra help. 4 months after the mediation session, the restaurant won a Best Family Dining Award from the local business association. Jasper called to tell me the news and insisted I attend the ceremony as a partner, since my consulting work and recipe training had been crucial to the restaurant's turnaround. The ceremony was at a hotel ballroom downtown, with about 200 people from various local businesses. I stood on stage accepting the award alongside Valentina and Jasper, holding the heavy glass trophy while cameras flashed and people applauded. Standing there, I felt Dad's presence strongly, like he was watching and nodding his approval at how we'd restored his vision after everything that had gone wrong. Valentina squeezed my hand during the speech Jasper gave about family legacy and authentic cooking, and I had to blink back tears. That night after the ceremony, Tommy and I were sitting at our kitchen table eating leftover birthday cake when he looked up at me with serious eyes. He said he wanted to be a chef like me and Grandpa when he grew up, and he wanted to learn everything about cooking that I could teach him. We pulled out Dad's old recipe notebook together, the one with his handwriting that still made my chest tight every time I saw it. I started teaching Tommy some of the more advanced techniques, showing him how to properly dice an onion and explaining why Dad always insisted on toasting spices before grinding them. Tommy absorbed everything like a sponge, asking questions and taking notes in his own little notebook. Watching him develop the same passion for cooking that Dad had instilled in me felt like the best kind of full circle. 2 weeks later, a man in a suit showed up at my cart during the lunch rush and waited patiently in line. When he reached the front, he introduced himself as a food distributor who worked with local grocery stores throughout the region. He'd been eating at both my cart and the restaurant for months, and he wanted to talk about bottling and selling my salsa commercially. The demand was clearly there, he explained, showing me sales projections and distribution networks on his tablet. It was a huge opportunity that could provide stable income beyond the daily grind of cart operations, and it would spread Dad's recipes even further throughout the community and beyond. We exchanged contact information and scheduled a meeting to discuss details, licensing agreements, and production requirements. Driving home that evening, I thought about how far Tommy and I had come from those days at the laundromat, watching Dad's restaurant through the window and feeling completely shut out from our own family legacy. The salsa distributor and I met 3 times over the following 2 weeks to work out the details of the licensing agreement. I insisted on keeping full control over the recipe and production quality, which meant I had approval rights over every ingredient and could pull the license if standards dropped. He agreed to a royalty structure that gave me 15% of wholesale revenue, and we signed the contract on a Tuesday morning at the commissary, with Tommy watching and asking questions about what everything meant. The first production run happened at a local facility that specialized in small batch sauces, and I spent an entire day there supervising to make sure they followed Dad's recipe exactly, toasting the chilies properly, and using fresh garlic instead of powder, like so many commercial operations did. 2 weeks after the jars hit shelves at 6 neighborhood grocery stores, every single one had sold out. The store manager started calling the distributor asking for more, and suddenly Dad's salsa was shipped to 12 stores, then 20, then stores across 3 zip codes. Walking through the grocery store with Tommy and seeing those jars with Dad's recipe inside, knowing that hundreds of families were tasting his food in their own kitchens, made something tight in my chest finally loosen a little bit. Valentina called me one evening about a month later, her voice different from I'd heard it in years. Jasper had promoted her to general manager with full authority over all restaurant operations, including hiring, firing, scheduling, and menu decisions. Her salary nearly doubled, and she finally had the power to fix all the problems Diego had created. She'd given raises to every staff member, implemented fair scheduling so people could actually plan their lives, and started weekly meetings where everyone could suggest improvements without fear of being yelled at. The kitchen staff told her they actually enjoyed coming to work now, which hadn't been true in years under Diego's management. She met me for coffee on Sunday morning and told me something I hadn't expected. She said that saving the restaurant had also saved her, giving her confidence and purpose that she'd lost somewhere along the way while working under Diego's constant criticism and control. Watching her sit across from me with straight shoulders and clear eyes, talking about her plans for expanding the catering menu and training new cooks, I realized my sister had been buried under Diego's management, just like Dad's recipes had been. 1 year after Diego confronted me in that parking lot, I arrived at my lunch spot to prep for the rush and found a line of customers that already stretched around the block. Miguel from the construction crew stood first in line like always, grinning and holding up his phone to show me he'd been there since 11:15, even though I didn't start serving until 11:30. Rodriguez was there with his entire shop crew, still in their work uniforms with grease on their hands. The teachers from Tommy's school had walked over together on their lunch break. The nurses from the medical center, the office workers who'd been coming since week 3, Mrs. and King from the dry cleaners, the veterinary clinic staff. Dozens of regulars who knew their orders by heart and asked about Tommy's grades and told me about their own families. They weren't just customers anymore. They were neighbors, friends, people who'd watched me build something real from nothing and had chosen to be part of it. Tommy handed out orders with perfect accuracy, calling people by name and remembering their preferences without checking notes. Extra salsa verde for Miguel, no onions for Mrs. King, double cheese for the teacher who always came last because her classroom was furthest from the parking lot. He moved between the cart and the customers with the same easy confidence Dad used to have, making people smile and feel seen. I cooked Dad's recipes with the same care and love he'd taught me during those quiet morning prep sessions, using his techniques for toasting spices and his trick for getting the perfect texture on rice. I was feeding my community honest food at fair prices, building a legacy that honored Dad's memory while creating my own path forward. Life wasn't perfect. Diego and I would probably never be truly close again, and some family relationships had changed in ways that couldn't be undone. But standing at my bright yellow cart with Tommy beside me and a line of people waiting for food made with love, I'd built something real and good with my son, and that was more than enough.